Okay, that is working now. And so we will call to order this joint meeting of the Easton Reading Region 9 Policy Committee, March 26, 2021 at 9:05 a.m. Item number 2. Now, I'm apologies again. It's been insane with the budgets and sort of preparing for the budget conversations with the Board of Finance. And so I think there's a matter of actually reviewing the minutes and making sure that they're reflecting what is recorded and has been published on the video stream of the meeting. So I think we have a full accounting of the video streams, but I don't know that the minutes necessarily are detailed in there. So I'm going to go back through this weekend, now that
I'll do one set of them, John.
Okay,
I wasn't at those meetings.
Okay.
I'll watch last week.
Yep. And you can watch them at two times speed to get to each of the milestones and that stuff. But yeah, so I'll just make sure that those meeting minutes are accurately reflecting the sort of what's captured in the video, and make sure that we get those approved and finalized. That takes us to public comment. No members of the public being present. We'll go to committee member comment. Any comments from committee members? No? Okay. So that takes us into, in this week, I think we want to make sure that we give time if needed for administrative updates and sort of discussion on some of the administrative, side of the work that we're doing. But where we had left off and where I think we're hoping to sort of bottom out on the conversation with relation to item 5A, the CABE model policy review, which we have been in the last 3 weeks reviewing essentially a part of the CABE policy in the 9000 series that relates to bylaws and the sort of functioning of boards, but in a way that is specific to our sort of unique structure when it comes to sort of meetings where all 3 boards are getting together. And so the work that we started doing was to just draft out and make sure that we have a sort of firm grasp on, what are the issues that come up? Where are the places where there's a necessity to, sort of find a reasonable path on conflict resolution and sort of other items like that. So I think we can
to put a fine point on it, John. It's in this committee's position that we're not going to make recommendations or meddle in the bylaws as they relate to individual board governance and leave that to the individual boards, but instead to treat our charge to include the tri-board work and how the 3 boards work together, when, where, why, how, to make a recommendation so that all 3 boards are on the same page to the extent that's possible.
That's exactly correct. I think we've stated that each week just to make sure that in the record we're crystal clear about that. Because
if anybody's watching one of these videos without seeing the other ones, it's
exactly. Yeah, thank you. All right, so let me share my screen here. Which I totally know how to do. There we go. And actually, before we dive in too much, Dr. Pearson, is there do you have an estimate for the amount of time that you'd be looking for on the administrative update side?
I do not. So I have 2 things on my mind. I just thought update discussion with the group about the status of the Title IX policy adoption. And then a first conversation about our current policy regarding school climate, keeping in mind the new legislation that's in place.
Okay. All right, good. So maybe.
So I would say 15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Okay. We had, and this document is what we've been using as we've been meeting to just make sure that we're capturing all the ideas. Everybody's able to read it in terms of the size of the font and everything? Okay. I think I've just had it open the entire time. That's the only reason why it's already zoomed into the right. So I'll just briefly hit each of the sections. So meeting protocols and talking about the sort of how the chair rotates, how we think about the motions carried by all 3 boards, tri-board meetings, and sort of what that really is, that there is no legal entity that is the tri-board. so making it clear sort of that's actually 3 individual boards meeting separately. Sort of a huge amount of focus on that sort of dispute resolution process. And then we sort of dive into each one of these things. And we started talking about like, what are the responsibilities of the tri-boards? You know, sort of when the boards get together, what responsibilities do we share? And then diving into detail on the sort of meeting governance. And then a little bit of detail on joint committees, because I think there are actually some pending questions there. Also, just a note to everyone, I'm going to say April 8th. I'm hoping that's the right date. Yep. April 8th, we have a meeting scheduled in the evening, or that we are going to schedule a special meeting in the evening on April 8th. It will still be a meeting of this joint policy committee, but we're scheduling it at night and really trying to get as many board members to attend so that they have the opportunity to hear sort of to hear about the work that we're doing and to sort of give us their input about that. Okay, so any specific thoughts that anyone's had since our last meeting, or sort of specific areas that you have an interest in diving into?
I think I might appreciate Maureen's thoughts on some of these, because there's some sort of meaty procedural technical issues that I think she might have some valuable input on.
Okay.
Specifically?
Let's go there.
John, if you want to start with kind of the various levels of sort of dispute resolution, that might be a good thing to kind of workshop a little bit.
Yeah, and it's I think to lead into that conversation, we've talked about the idea of there are procedural issues and then there are substantive issues, and if we don't have complete unanimity across 21 members, and what we're trying to do is to go to executive session or add an agenda item or table a motion or adjourn, we have questions about, like, does that require this level or does it require this level? And so there's this concept of we maybe have different gates for depending on the importance of that, which then also necessitates this idea of, should we have an appointed or a sort of voted on parliamentarian at the beginning of each tri-board meeting, like that kind of thing, so that person is going to be the person, you know, who's going to help us define the difference between procedural and substantive. So none of that is decided. That's all just sort of ideas that we've been discussing. So when we talk about the sort of dispute resolution process, we've come up with 4 options. One, the mechanism, right? This thing that has been alluded to in many meetings before. I've never personally witnessed as a board member.
Can someone define it, please?
Absolutely. So we think an accurate definition of the mechanism is, at least the way that it's been used recently, is that in the event that a motion carries 2 of the 3 boards, it fails. However, the boards may elect to vote a second time, and on such a motion, if it carries 2 of the 3 boards a second time, it may be voted on a third time. If it passes,
but do all 3 boards have to elect to vote on it the second time?
It's a very good question, how that works and sort of what it means to elect to vote on that.
Right. I mean, obviously, if the dissenting board says we're not going to vote again, the mechanism has no point, because they could spike it in that.
Not necessarily. Well, it does have a point, because people can vote down the issue and vote up the prospect of moving it along, sort of like a quasi abstention, like we saw last night, John.
Yeah, that's right.
They can act by non-acting.
Yeah.
So I disagree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my understanding in the past had been that when it's a 2-1, it just went to a second vote without a discussion as to whether to go to a second vote. More recently, when we've had a 2-1, it was just treated as it's failed and we moved on. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the sort of squishiness here.
I don't have a frame of reference to say this has historically been the way that it's done. Maybe Gwen has that frame of reference. I don't. And my limited frame of reference says that it's sort of been massaged each time the issue has sort of been walked around.
Yep.
So no one has said this is our procedure. And you might not even be able to get people to agree on what the procedure would have been. I guess my framework for analysis here is to identify the points at which you need the discussion. Like, okay, 2 of the 3 boards have confirmed, 1 has denied. Now what happens specifically in that little gap there?
Right. Do all 3 boards have to call the question a second time?
Right.
My memory of when this has been used in the past has been that it's been like at a last resort point.
Yeah.
You know, when the conversation has gone on and on and on, and they're just, the boards are at an impasse. And specifically, the meeting that's coming to mind has to do with central office agreement. And so it's sort of like, well, how are we gonna get past this? Because we just can't move forward. And at that point, it's brought into play. And clearly it's an imperfect solution.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Stephanie. That's the only time I remember it being invoked. But I believe it was a central office budget. And as we've also talked about last week, it all depends on good faith, because legally the boards are separate entities, and I don't know what power 2 boards have to induce a 3rd board to do something that they don't want to do.
Right.
And it's a little bit different for a central office budget that maybe you could see versus a hiring of a senior central office personnel. I think at the end of the day, if the board can always take their ball and go home, right?
Right.
I'm not obviously advocating for that, but I think that all of this depends on everybody wanting to.
And I think some of this is recognizing that all 3 boards have that independent authority to pick up their ball and go home if they don't like the direction that a discussion is going. That some of this is a deliberate concession of some of that authority to the sort of trilateral structure, in as much as, the 3 boards have agreed this is the way we're going to settle disputes, to the exclusion of we're just going to take our ball and go home, because it's sort of we're deliberately giving up that as an option. But by agreeing to this,
it's also more on in the way of a sort of memorandum of understanding, right? We are all agreeing, when we're not in the midst of conflict, that this is the best practice. This is the way that we should be doing this. And so if we, in the midst of conflict, decide to eject from, and oh, by the way, this is only option 1. We have other options to provide here. And this whole conversation, and the majority of the sort of thrust of this conversation, is absolutely about when there is conflict between the boards.
And the answer might be that this mechanism doesn't make sense.
That's right. And if that's the output, like, that's fine. I just don't want somebody to continue to say, oh, we've got a mechanism, but only when it's convenient for us. Because, by the way, when we look at the results of when the mechanism has been used, it's been my board that's been the subject of being forced to do things that they didn't want to do. So right now, I'm saying, let's all agree, what's the process, right? And that doesn't change the authority of individual boards to say, I recognize we agreed to this, but in this case, we're going to take our ball and go home. But that should be viewed as, you are departing from the norm. You are departing from what you said you were going to do, and you better have a really good reason for doing that.
I agree with you, John. I think that part of the framework for maybe how we think about these things is twofold. Do we define the mechanism's use only in certain circumstances as opposed to others? Because that may or may not be palatable.
Yeah.
So you narrow the instances when it's used. And before you even do that, you try to come to a common understanding of what an impasse is.
Yep, absolutely. And maybe the parliament helps to decide that we're at an impasse or whatever. I think it's absolutely, and that it's a part of what we're talking about when we say sort of procedural versus substantive, but we could further define that to say, substantive issues related to, the hiring or the appointment of senior personnel. We could define it in a narrower term that says these are the cases where it's allowed to be used.
Without
I like the
getting too
parliamentarian
Byzantine.
idea, by the way.
without getting too Byzantine and complicated, really, we have a number of different options we can apply to different circumstances, as long as everybody sort of agrees in advance that these are the circumstances by which this sort of thinking applies. So,
That's right.
you know, from the simpler side of just a bare majority of 21 or those voting can take action, all the way to the complex of it needs all boards to have a majority voting, or else there's no way it can pass.
That's right. Side. Yeah. So maybe we just, let's quickly highlight each one of these things. I think Maureen, you're right to have, sort of flagged may elect, the boards may elect to vote. Well, what does that mean? Right. Mm-hmm. And so we should provide a little bit more clarity on that. But, second option, supermajority, essentially 75% of all members, and no weighting, sort of whatever weighting is happening on the Region 9 board. That the idea would be that this is just a one vote, one member, one vote methodology. So all of those, sort of 75% present and voting. And then third option, simple majority. So one more than half. And then option 4, there is no way to resolve.
Yeah, but that abdicates our role here. So I think you can strike option
4.
Well,
I think there's a question of, are there circumstances where every board needs to agree to something or it doesn't happen? I think the answer might be that there are. Like, we're not going to hire a superintendent jointly if one board dissents.
Right. One board cannot be forced to make a superintendent hire without, we all three have to agree. We could say that. So this becomes the sort of which path do you go down? And it's possible that all 4 exist. It's possible that only 3 exist. It's possible that only 1 exists. Cool. Okay.
And Maureen, can you think of other mechanisms by which, other procedures by which to resolve disputes that might fit into this framework?
Fitting into framework as absolute options, give me a little time to brainstorm, other than right this second, because I haven't thought about it except for this second. But so the answer is right this second, no.
So one of the things we talked about and said, here's a bad idea. I think I'm the one who said, hey, here's a bad idea, is we have an arbitrator who we have somebody who, or we go to arbitration, right? Or we have somebody who's going to sit in with us. We have an attorney who will sit in with us and make the decision for us when we disagree.
I mean, you could force, there's part of that idea that's actually really valid. You can force people to have good, solid mediation training. So that people with hot heads don't polarize the group. And that I've seen happen. I've seen that happen on meetings. Where
historically, when the mechanism has been invoked and it's led to a change in voting, it's been because the boards were meeting in person, recessed, and people went out into the hallway to have sort of those cooling off conversations with each other. Now, there's all manner of FOI issues with that, but that's been the history of how cooler heads have prevailed, is let's take a break and take a walk kind of thing.
Right. I mean, the idea of taking a break was part of me saying, maybe if the boards are deadlocked, you need to recess and come back and do it again and not be forced to make the decision in the heat of the moment. Now, people take different views about that. Sometimes the heat of the moment forces compromise, and sometimes you get consensus if you pull back. I think that's, people have varying theories on that.
Yeah.
I certainly would, in addition to implicit bias training that we all need, really try to force people on boards to undergo some kind of mediation training.
I like that a lot. Yeah, it feels like I think it would benefit us all if we sort of had some, new board member orientation, or even a sort of every board member orientation, and then this is the new, orientation.
This becomes the onboarding package.
Yeah, and that is, here is a course on mediation. Here's a course on, implicit bias. Here's a course on FOIA.
FOIA, real time, real now. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, and I, very much think it would help smooth out a lot of the problems that we have.
It shouldn't be a learn on the job kind of skill. So the third year in your board tenure, you figure out what FOIA stands for.
That's right. No, it's right. Well, and I think I've said this before. Our bylaws specifically say new board members will have an orientation, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, where's that orientation process? I know I didn't get it. Like,
It's the email Vicky sends you with how to log into your email.
The other thing that, people in a mediation kind of context would learn is that taking the floor in certain circumstances is a good idea, but being succinct and compact in the way you answer is a better one.
Yeah, I that's a point really well made, and especially with the context of Stephanie being here, how many meetings we drag our central office staff to, and our building leaders to, that they get to watch us, swirl for 30 minutes or an hour on a point that is like, wait, what? So the end result was yes on a question that asked for yes or no. And we spent, and everybody thought yes at the beginning, and there was no value in the exploration that we just did. Like, what are we doing here?
I mean, some
Honestly,
of that comes down.
I would extend that to administration. I mean, there have been plenty of times over the last decade when I've been in a meeting and a question is asked of the administration, and rather than just having the honest, immediate answer of, I don't have that information available right now, I'll get back to you, we attempt to try and recall what might be the answer, which then just leads to a much longer conversation that's many times not fruitful or necessary.
Yeah, we can all be guilty of it. At work, I've taken to noting, like, just want to make sure we're all clear. We're 15 minutes into this 30-minute meeting, and we haven't touched the issue. And I know I just took 5 of those minutes, but can we? Yeah.
I mean, I think some of the meeting circling comes down to not willing to necessarily trust your committees to make recommendations and trust those recommendations, and relitigating every issue at the board level.
Yeah.
And 2, general lack of preparedness. Like, if you're given a written report in advance and you don't read it until you get there, I'm sorry, we're moving on.
Yes. But also
there's a balance between, administration prepares a beautiful 30-page PowerPoint and then talks through every single point. So it's an hour-long presentation. And maybe we could have read that ahead of time, and it could have been a 15-minute presentation with questions.
Yeah.
But that all relies on us also reading it ahead of time so that we're ready to ask the questions and not have, somebody have to read it to us out loud.
Yeah.
But which all circles back to, what are the expectations for board members? And there are no strict expectations for board members except what the board member takes upon themselves. And that leads to a whole
real life, it could
and
be
real life intercedes too, Chris.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely, 100%.
for
Is
everybody.
it absolutely clear what the role of the committees?
No.
yes, it's not.
It
Right?
should
Because
be clear.
I
but it's
do
not.
feel as if there've been plenty of circumstances where a committee has lengthy, purposeful conversations on a given topic, and then comes forward with a recommendation to the board. And a board member or many board members might say, well, I can't vote on this because I haven't been actively involved in this. I haven't reviewed all the materials. And so it just makes me wonder about the role of the committees.
I was going to talk. Sorry, I just wanted, because I was going to talk about the exact same thing, because I know exactly what Stephanie is talking about. And it was, I think in many ways, my fault, right? I was coming as a representative of the curriculum committee. I think I was the only one who was actually at the meeting on sex education and what's going on in the schools. And so I brought a summary, not realizing this level summary was not going to cut it for the board. They needed a more comprehensive thing. And what we ended up doing is I presented and say, here's our findings. We ready to move forward? And they're like, no, we want much more detail. We want to see lessons. And it's like, okay, so this is a totally different scenario. And Stephanie ended up having to give the exact same presentation that she gave to the curriculum committee and taking us through in an hour and a half to the full board. And it was a very painful process and a learning point for me that says there are certain issues that are going to send up a red flag that people are going to want to dig into. And we got to figure out a way to get them to pay attention at the right time.
Yeah,
I've asked a few times, but I think it would be good practice.
Too.
I think it would be good practice to make sure that when committee meetings are noticed, that all board members get copies of the agendas
Yes.
so that nobody feels like they've been sandbagged later and say, I didn't know there was a meeting to talk about the fill in the blank.
Yes.
So I don't feel prepared to talk about it. Because if there's an issue that matters to you and you're not on that committee,
Right.
You can find a way to make sure that your voice is heard
Well,
in the
yeah.
recommendation phase.
Up to and including the chair and sometimes members of committees. I've been posthumously invited to meetings that I was actually the policy committee at the very beginning of my sort of tenure on the board. There was a meeting of the policy committee that I wasn't invited to, and they're like, "Hey John, why weren't you at this?" Because no one told me that it was happening. So yeah.
Well, this also ties into the issues with the website and the way there's no calendar that you can just look at to see what's going on today.
Yeah.
Oh, is there somebody having a meeting tonight? I can't remember. But the only way to find that out is kind of to leave.
Yeah, it's not great. I know Rydell is looking at sort of options for improving that. And it's, our YouTube videos are sort of everything. Like we're doing a lot of work to try to create transparency, and sometimes it's undermined by just our website, and I think it's sort of the website vendor that we have has very limited options, to sort of create the kind of things that we're looking for. So,
but I think this discussion and others like it have surfaced a few issues relating to ways of working, onboarding, and sort of common understandings of expectations, which will help us improve processes across the board, I would think.
So, and specifically related to like what we're talking about, and our entry point into this conversation is there are sort of model CABE policies related to bylaws, and those bylaws generally dictate the way that a board will sort of work, so the inner workings of that board. We are saying we specifically are not going at the individual bylaws of each board, and those are for each board to decide how they're going to work, how many members they're going to have, how like that stuff. But it is together that we want to define, how we're going to work together. My board's bylaws have specific details about board members should be getting professional development. It's called professional development for board members. My board's bylaws have specifics about you should onboard your members this way. This is they should have an orientation that includes this and this and this. We are not doing that. And so I'm not saying because individual boards may not be doing these things that they should be doing, that then we should sort of step in as the joint policy committee and rewrite every board's bylaws, but we have to do something. So, I would happily bring my board's bylaws here to this group and look for input. And obviously I still would take that back to my board, just like we take everything from committees back to our respective boards and say, hey, here is the sort of considered thinking of, really smart people who spend a lot of time, with me thinking about policy. Here is how we think we need to adjust these so that we end up in a position where we're actually doing the stuff that we said we need to do to be healthy board members.
But don't we need those policies to be consistent in terms of onboarding across all boards?
I think it's useful, but I think it's a difficult, like, I think if the boards come to the same place, that's nice. That would be good. I don't feel like we can compel the boards, to sort of go adjust their bylaws to suit our preference. But
I do think there might be a space for the three boards to come together on an onboarding program that is joint. And so in December of odd number years, the new members of all three boards are invited to location for training on FOI and roles and responsibilities and whatever. And either CABE can come, or Tom Hennick can come, or some combination of senior board members and those people can put on some kind of a bespoke training for ER9 board members. And all board members can attend, because I think that a refresher is going to always be helpful. The same way I encourage people to go to the FOI training every 2 years.
Yeah, I actually really like that perspective, and especially, as it relates, because when I look at those bylaws and I go, all right, I need to build that. I need to build that program. I need to build the orientation process. And I know what that looks like. I've built programs before. It's a lot of work. And with everything else that we're doing, it's not at the front of the line. And
Right.
yet, we get new members, and we could end up souring members who would otherwise be really, sort of positive contributors to the overall dialogue and their skills and their perspectives and all those. And we sour them because we didn't have time to do the right onboarding.
We could exercise a huge ROI with a small investment in doing that.
Yeah. And so if we can come together to say, here are some sample policies, and then actually here is some, here, we can sort of all contribute to the creation of that onboarding package, that would be remarkable. Because if all I have to do is say, I'm going to go work on building up the FOIA component to that, and somebody else is going to go work on what it means to be on a committee, and somebody else is going to work on, and we can all contribute to that. Or in many cases, probably, let me just go find the resource that has already done a very good job of explaining this and just bring it into a central location. Yeah. Okay. So I think
we really diverted from the agenda here. So.
Well, I don't know, because I think what we're talking about is, sort of joint committees and like, what is the purpose of the committee? We're talking about the bylaws and the functioning of this is right in line with sort of, there's a part of the CAPE policy that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks. But, now what we're talking about is, okay, what is the work to actually live up to those bylaws, that are in that 9,000 series of the CAPE policy? That, you're right, that gets into another subject. I don't think we have a committee for, orientation or anything. Yeah. And I don't think we need it. I don't think we need a committee. I think we can just all sort of work together to start fleshing out some of those things, and then, bring them to our boards. So, okay. I think we have about 10 minutes left before we want to sort of turn the floor over to Stephanie. Anything else that, let me just, I want to make sure that we're ready for the 8th. So to do for the 8th. What do we think is going to be sort of really necessary for having a sort of fruitful discussion?
I think we want to both time box and subject box the conversation so that we're asking board members critical questions. I want feedback on these questions. Please tell me what you think about A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Because we can't spend hours on each of them, but it's tell me how you think we should resolve a dispute about, adding an agenda item. Describe to me what you think is the appropriate process for solving a dispute about the central office budget, hiring people. And I think the hiring people overlaps with the negotiating committee question as to where does the hiring authority begin and end from the board level. But be that as it may, the dispute resolution function would be similar.
I also think, and you guys have said this before collectively, that this is a Q&A to other people. This is not, we're presenting it in a free-for-all discussion. We are acting in the perspective of sort of, the judge who's on an appellate panel saying, okay, I'm asking you a question. Answer it, answer it, answer it, answer it.
Right.
That's got to be the format for this meeting. Otherwise, on any one of these issues, it'll devolve.
Right. And I think that we frame it by sending those critical questions to the board in advance in a one-way memo that says, we're meeting to talk about this. Here are the questions we expect to talk about. Please think about them in advance. We'll be asking you these questions. Because otherwise it'll be a half an hour run up and people won't be prepared to have the conversation. And this is a feedback session for us to then craft something based on the feedback.
Yep. Okay, what are the questions? Tell me, so what do you think the appropriate process is for adding an agenda item? That was one of the examples you gave. I mean,
Right. Almost anything below can be kind of
Yeah.
Converted to a
Flip into that.
question.
right.
Right.
And add in, do you believe there should be specific funded process for onboarding of board members?
Executive session table. Okay, so it's
All this can be converted to questions, right?
Yep.
And I think you can put in there option 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the preface too, and say, in resolving disputes, you prefer option 1, 2, 3, 4, or other.
I really don't think of 4 as an option, but
Well, option 1, 2, 3, or there is no resolution.
right.
right. We are hopelessly deadlocked on
Right.
all subjects.
I mean, in theory, you could ask questions about, do you agree that the purpose of that tri-board meetings are meetings of the board meeting jointly, but it's sort of self-proving. It doesn't.
I don't know that I
Need to-
would get that esoteric, Chris.
Yeah, exactly. I don't
I
think you need
wouldn't.
to have that conversation.
I think you want to focus on very practical questions with very practical answers.
Hmm.
Do you like the idea of a parliamentarian to resolve procedural disputes and to say that one dispute is procedural versus substantive? Do you like the idea of a parliamentarian who would be elected by a simple majority vote of all 3 boards at the beginning of any session in which their significant dispute was expected?
Right. You can do it at the beginning of any session. You could do it at the beginning of a calendar year. There's lots of different ways you can.
However you choose to do it.
Yeah. And I think you'd probably want to give comfort to people that in a sort of Roberts world, that the parliamentarian's decision could be overturned by a majority of the whole boards or whatever it is, if there was a dispute about that determination. But so I just think there'll be people who think that that's giving too much control to them.
There's always tension, Chris, between giving
yeah.
someone the right to make a decision and trying to make a decision with a very collective body, right? There's always that tension. So you have to point it out that the parliamentarian's role sometimes is to point out their own view and have that become the biggest view in the room for a little while.
So that the ball can be advanced a little bit. And
Right. I mean, it's the same theory as sometimes the loudest voice gets heard. Well, and you don't always want that, but if you believe in the process, sometimes just having a loud voice takes people back on their heels.
I'm hesitant to add a question about essentially, do you think board members need training? Because they do.
Fair.
And if I and those who need that training may not necessarily recognize that they need that training, or may react to this idea of like, wait a second, are you putting me into days of professional development stuff? And their experience with that is an experience through work where they're going through legal and compliance training, and they're like, no, I do not believe that board members need training. Like,
well, you could ask the question, do you think that board members who aren't you need training? And then they'll all say yes.
And then you've eliminated, the possibility that they say that they're not biased too, right?
right. So I'm more inclined to, sort of have that as a discussion inside of the context of a sort of individual board meeting to get people, to discuss that, as opposed to everybody come and just sort of say yes, no to this, because I think it requires sort of a meatier discussion that I think comes outside of the scope.
It's a
of this.
collateral issue that kind of gets away from the core. How are you coming to an MOA between the boards on
Right. That's right.
core governance?
That's right. Any other sort of big, and I agree, these are multiple questions. Any other thoughts about sort of categories of questions that we want to put in before we turn it over to Stephanie?
So you put in that first bullet, basically, what we had as substantive below.
Yeah,
We wanted
The procedural and substantive, and then I would break it out into a bunch of different questions.
Do we want to talk about the hiring question at all, or do we want to defer that entirely to negotiating committee? Because there's this range of opinion as to how deep the board's hiring authority goes, and which boards have delegated which authority to administration. And it creates conflict.
Yeah, I think we have a mandate as a policy committee to recommend policy and sort of the process that I think the charge of the negotiating committee also has that, but I almost feel like the negotiating committee is going to pass that over to the policy committee, and the policy committee is going to sort of put that into a package, which then it recommends to the boards.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could possibly see that the other, from another direction as well, though, because like DEI, the DEI committee, I think if we touch on subjects of curriculum, I would think we pass that then to the curriculum committee.
Right. We flagged this issue. Can you please consider it in the curriculum context?
Exactly. So it's, sort of who's passing what to who. I think that it feels more like the policy committee is a more longstanding and sort of exists in a place where the negotiating committee should pass us their look at this, here's what we think the right answer is.
Right. Can you enshrine that in some way?
Exactly.
And how does it impact with 4311? There's some policy where the boards delegate authority to the superintendent on hiring, and
right,
there needs to be some level of uniformity of that so there's not a conflict.
Right. Yep. So, but I think we can talk about, sort of all of these substantive issues plus appointment of senior personnel, right? We see what we had stated down here, appointment of senior personnel will always require approval of all three boards. That we can certainly pose as a question.
You don't ask any questions about committees here, and I'm not sure you need to, but because I'm not sure how controversial it ultimately is to say it's our recommendation that joint committees serve this recommending function shall have equal votes in this way. It's,
I think it's more a function of board member training than dispute resolution, because I think actually right now there's very little controversy around joint committees and committees in general. There's just a lack of understanding.
Right. I think that just becomes a declaration of when a committee makes a recommendation, there should be a presumption that the committee has done its homework and that the whole board's not going to relitigate the same issue.
Yeah.
Absent some sort of change in circumstance.
Yeah. But and then again, I think there's some committee member training to say, recognize when it's necessary to clearly demonstrate that you've done your homework and what goes into that.
Yeah. I mean, the relitigating issue is such a time waster. So I sit in meetings and I think that to myself over and over and over again.
Right.
And I want to time box people's comments in certain contexts and say, you got 3 minutes, or my old lawyer adage is, if you can't make your point in 3 sentences, shut up.
I haven't heard that adage. I like it though. I'll
true.
Start trying to use it at work.
Witnesses on the stand with opposing counsel, as short as you can possibly give me an answer. With me, 3 sentences, never more. I'll get it if I need it.
I'll keep following up until I get it.
Yep.
Anyway. Okay. So I'd like to break here and move to the next agenda item to make sure that Dr. Pearson-Ugal has the opportunity to dive in. All right, so I'll stop.
So, John, are you taking away that you're going to send a memo to the boards with respect to April 8th?
Yeah. So I can do that, or I can send it to the members of this for each of us to send to our respective boards. What's the best process?
And if you send out something, maybe we can all flesh out questions for you in a little bit more precise of a way, or would you like them the way they are right now?
So my intent was to draft this a little bit more. I think if we go back and forth as a committee, I think we're running into FOIA issues. in the sort of the drafting of that document.
I think if you send an email to the three of us saying, this is what I propose to send as a draft to the boards, and any of us have comments individually back to you, it's not problematic.
Okay. Another solution could be I send it to all of you for you to send to your respective boards, and then you can make whatever edits you want. But then we don't necessarily have a perfectly aligned thing. I worry a little bit about the sort of transition of a sort of electronic communication that is a sense a serial meeting.
I have faith in whatever you draft being sufficient to spark the conversation on April 8th. So
okay. All right, very good. So yes, I will draft something and I will send it. Okay. All right, very good. Stephanie?
Okay. So the first item for our discussion should be fairly quick, and it's just a check-in on the status of the Title IX policy adoption. I admit that I've just lost track a little bit in terms of the three boards, and I want to be sure that I'm checking the agendas carefully because that policy needs to be adopted if it hasn't been already.
So Easton has done first and second reading and has adopted it.
Okay.
Reading has not touched it. We're meeting specially on Monday. I might be able to still amend the agenda to edit, it being Friday, but the town is closed.
And Region 9 has not touched it.
Okay. So you both need first readings.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if I can get a first reading in on the 29th, then we're meeting in regular session the following week, and we can knock it out in 8 days.
That makes sense.
So when we get finished here, I'll see if Lana can revise the agenda.
Are there rules about policy being done in regular meetings?
I thought so, but you could correct
I thought so
me.
too, but I can't remember. I'm pretty sure we did both of ours in regular meetings, but I don't know if that was necessarily intentional.
It's a good question. I know in Reading we've held special meetings on at least one occasion just to have first readings of motions to check the box.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
a
I know
question
there's
I'll look
something
into.
about the time that has to pass between first and second reading.
Yeah, well, and there was a time. The only reason I have even a vague recollection of that is because when I first joined the board, there was I was handed the, hey, go rewrite our bylaws, and so I started doing that, and then there was a suggestion, we don't really need first and second reading, we can just approve this. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not allowed. So.
Okay. So the second sort of more substantial conversation has to do with the new legislation or the revised legislation regarding school climate, which should be reviewed and discussed by this committee. I believe that you all have it. Some of it includes information about what the state will do. They're going to form an advisory group there. So there are a number of deadlines for the state, but there is a revised definition of bullying. And so, John, I sent you the relevant policies for each of the three districts, what's a little odd to me, and I've sent a follow-up to one of the administrators at Barlow, is that the Region 9 policy is, it seems unusually old compared to the other two districts. The other two districts have policies on bullying that includes information about school climate, all of which is contained in the legislation. The Region 9 policy talks about aggressive behavior. So it seems to me that what we need to do is take a look at the new legislation and the wording, and then consider a revision of the existing policies. But I've asked for sort of a keyword search of all of the Region 9 policies to see if there might be another policy that contains more updated language. And so far we have not been able to locate that. So it might be that the Region 9 needs, well, frankly, if together you can create one policy, that certainly makes sense. I don't know if there's anything unique at the high school level that might need to be in addition to.
Should we take this up then in our meeting immediately following the Easter break? I guess Good Friday, we're off next Friday. So then the following Friday, should we look to put that on the agenda
I
for
think
that?
that makes sense. I think that makes sense. Gives everyone enough time to review the legislation and then the current policies with respect to bullying. Some of this I think will be pretty quick. Other parts will probably require a more lengthy conversation.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Anybody else have anything? Okay, good.
So John, do you want to share the policies that I just shared with you with everyone else, or I can do it? Doesn't matter.
I'm actually, so I'm forwarding / asking Sharon to add this as an agenda item in the meeting following the Friday, and I was going to include everybody on this
Perfect.
call. So yes. Okay. Good. Public comment, no members of the public being present. We'll go to board member or committee member comment. Okay, look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you. Any objections? Very good. Then we are adjourned at 9:56 a.m. Thanks very much, everybody.
John, are you and Chris staying on?
Yeah, just for a minute.
We have a
Discuss
different
some totally different
non-policy
topic?
non-policy stuff to